and civil society members and everyone involved here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chang Dae-hwan, Executive Chairman of the World Knowledge Forum and Chairman of Megyoung Media Group, will come forward for his opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Executive Chairman Chang Dae-hwan with a big round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World Knowledge Forum 2022. We are currently faced with multiple challenges, including the global pandemic, the war in Ukraine, significant disruptions in supply chains, inflation, and climate change. Arnold Toynbee, the English historian and a philosopher of history, pointed out that the history of mankind is a series of cycles of challenges and responses. The World Knowledge Forum 2022 will be held under the theme of super compensation to discuss prosperity after crisis and how to respond wisely to grand challenges. Here are two encyclopedias. One was published in Paris, France in 1751, and the other in Beijing, China, around the same period of time. The encyclopedia published in Paris was written by a collaborative group of about 140 top-notch European intellectuals, including Voltaire and Rousseau. It contains arguments to defend civil liberties and freedom of knowledge against the tyrannical political power. This encyclopedia marked a new milestone in human history as it eventually led to French Revolution and served as a momentum of shaping and spreading liberal democracy throughout the world. The revolution contributed to the rapid development in science and technology and triggered creative destruction. Meanwhile, in Beijing, China, Emperor Qianlong gave the order to compile the Siku Quanshu, or the complete library of the four treasures, during the period of the Qing dynasty. This compilation is one of the largest traditional collections of Chinese literature and writings of all types, embracing the knowledge of the Confucian culture. The dominating content of this encyclopedia, however, is based on the limited knowledge compiled by the emperor's absolute power and Confucian-centered discourse system. It was around that period of time that the Western modern society, based on free market economy, overtook the East. Freedom was regarded as the prerequisite to prosperity. The history of mankind was shaped through major crises, but freedom was consistently the driving force in overcoming the hardships. A typical example can be DuPont's achievements after the Great Depression. When scientists and engineers were struggling to find jobs due to the Great Depression, DuPont made an aggressive recruiting effort and hired them as research personnel. Chemist Wallace Carothers, who moved from Harvard University to DuPont's lab, worked with these researchers and invented the world's first stretched synthetic fiber, nylon. With this as a momentum, DuPont, which used to be a gunpowder company, grew into one of the world's leading chemical firms. DuPont accumulated competitiveness during the Great Depression, and after the economic recession, the company was at another level, making remarkable performances. This was indeed a good example of supercompensation. If it were not for the financial freedom, DuPont would have had a difficult time making such drastic decisions. The numerous inventions that were made in the 1930s served as a stepping stone for America's economic development. The U.S. economy was securing its capacity for super compensation during the period around that Great Depression. And freedom was the major engine. On June 5th, 1947, during the Marshall speech addressed by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall at Harvard University's commencement ceremony, the U.S. program to provide aid to post-war Europe was presented. He announced that our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. This was the famous European Recovery Program, more commonly known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was enacted in 1948 and provided aid to Western Europe following the devastation of World War II. Western Europe's growth rate recorded about 40% within 3 years and achieved super compensation. The philosophy of the Marshall Plan was directly applied to the policies towards economic revival in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and ultimately contributed to the economic miracles in Asia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Many people like to see me in person, so I came out. How's everybody doing this morning? A little bit sleepy? Sorry to wake you up early in the morning. 3 cases were introduced in the video. First, the encyclopedia published in Paris, then DuPont, which moved ahead during turbulent times, and the Marshall Plan that was executed to preserve freedom and prosperity in the disruptive circumstances. History proved how freedom was preserved during the recurring crisis and how freedom can serve as the key to achieving prosperity. We are currently stuck in multiple interconnected global crises. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is fueling fears of a new divided world. The pandemic proved how helplessly the global community can deal with the spread of infectious diseases. The global economy is seriously disrupted by the worldwide inflation, and the food and energy crisis are aggravating the disorder. Moreover, worsening of inequality and the spread of populism and political polarization are undermining the state of democracy. History tells us the driving force that enabled the world to overcome crisis was freedom. In this regard, it will be timely to re-examine how significant freedom can be. The basic elements of liberalism are to accept differences, to guarantee and protect the human rights to live, and to freely trade what they have with each other. Francis Fukuyama, a professor of Stanford University, suggested the restoration of freedom and democratic decision-making as a solution for the complex crisis.
In a democracy, you have discussion and debate, and when you're ready to decide to do something, you have much more buy-in from ordinary people, and hopefully, a better quality of decision making.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama. In 1978, the paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, invited Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek to Beijing. Deng Xiaoping requested on how Chinese people could overcome hunger. Hayek offered a countermeasure as follows: allow the market to be operated freely so that the peasants can directly sell their products. Hayek's solution was pretty simple and clear: to protect property rights and to ensure the freedom to trade. Ironically, it was the perception of liberalism that made China's present G2 economic miracle possible. Entrepreneurship based on liberal mind is indispensable to post-crisis reconstruction. In 1973, the global economy was faced with the first oil shock, spurred by the Fourth Middle East War. The Korean construction companies were commissioned in the Middle East, which was the epicenter of the crisis. By successfully retrieving oil money through construction works in the Middle East, South Korea overcame the economic crisis and reorganized its industry based on the accumulated capital. In September 1979, when the second oil crisis occurred, as a result of the Iranian Revolution, the Mail business newspaper introduced an article as follows: Samsung Electronics, in accordance with the resolution of the board of directors, decided to merge with Samsung Semiconductor. Without the fearless decision of former chairman Lee Kun-hee of Samsung Group, not only Samsung Electronics, but also South Korea, which is a semiconductor powerhouse, would not have existed. In order to deal with the global multiple crises, including pandemic, war in Ukraine, inflation, climate change, to name a few, we must learn from the courageous challenge spirit demonstrated in the Marshall Plan and the influential entrepreneurship. Freedom, furthermore, serves as an energy for future challenges. To overcome the multiple crises and ultimately achieve supercompensation, we need new guidance. With outdated instructions, it'll be impossible to explore the future. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chairman Chang Dae-hwan. Next, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, will kindly share with us his welcome remarks for the opening of World Knowledge Forum 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you for your warm introduction. Dr. Chang Dae-hwan, founder of World Knowledge Forum and chairman of the Megyoung Media Group, Honorable Kim Jin-pyo of National Assembly Speaker, and Honorable Han Duck-soo, Prime Minister of Korea, and Excellencies, many former heads of state of foreign government, including President Francois Hollande of France, and distinguished guests, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great privilege to deliver these remarks to announce the kickoff of the World Knowledge Forum 2022. I take this opportunity to offer my sincere congratulations on the organization of this 23rd World Knowledge Forum. This forum comes at a critical juncture as we seek ways to stabilize the volatile global environment where we find ourselves in and take tangible steps towards advancing peace and restoring global freedom and prosperity. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in an unprecedented era of interconnected crisis and heightened global insecurity and uncertainty. Great power tensions are surging, particularly the illegal Russian aggression of Ukraine represents one of the most dangerous moments for global security in decades. When it comes to the security environment on the Korean Peninsula, on September 8, the North Korean leader and government adopted a new law stipulating 5 specific conditions for use of nuclear weapons, such as when, first, North Korea judges nuclear or other WMD attacks has been conducted or imminent, or second, when nuclear or non-nuclear attack by hostile forces against North Korea's leadership, that means Kim Jong-un, or commanding system has been conducted or imminent. This is by far the most threatening and direct challenge against the norms of the international law and the NPT system. Ladies and gentlemen, on top of this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to disrupt our economies, societies, and daily lives. At the same time, our one and only planet Earth is on fire, figuratively and realistically, with the climate crisis continuously deepening. To respond to these crises, build sustainable peace, and restore global freedom and prosperity, we must raise our collective efforts and, for political leaders, raise their political ambition in the following 3 essential areas. First, despite the polarized situation of the UN Security Council as a result of Russia's veto, international community must do more to address the fallout and transnational spillover from the ongoing war in Ukraine. Such a fallout is being acutely felt across the world as Russia's weaponization of energy and food is putting dire pressure on so many people, including Africans. Under this backdrop, we must support the United Nations and others who are providing relief of various front lines of the global food crisis in particular. We must demonstrate our solidarity for the Ukrainian government and people who are suffering from this illegal aggression by Russia. Neutrality or silence in the face of this injustice is not an option. I visited Ukraine last month, August 16, and I saw with my own eyes these horrendous, horrible aggressions as well as human rights. Many people, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed ruthlessly. Second, we must need elevated action in the key spheres of climate mitigation, adaptation, innovation, and financial support to implement the Paris Climate Change Agreement, achieve the Agenda 2030 with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and save our planet Earth. Climate crisis is here and now. Therefore, despite the war in Ukraine, we must resist the temptation to backpedal towards fossil fuels and instead accelerate the green transition. Third, we must elevate collective efforts to bolster global health security, to persevere over existing threats and prepare for new ones. COVID-19 and other new viruses, such as monkeypox, have brought into focus the health security implications of biodiversity loss and exemplified that climate crisis and pandemics are two sides of the same coins. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, during this forum, I sincerely hope that you could help forge a timely solutions to the overlapping crises that human beings are currently facing. This must be founded in the global partnership and elevated peace, sustainability, freedom, and prosperity. Please remember that no country or no one in this world, however powerful, however resourceful one may be, cannot do alone this one. We must put all our hands on the deck together. We must make sure that we leave this planet Earth sustainably for our succeeding generation. That is our moral and your political responsibility who are sitting here as political leaders. And I count on your strong commitment to make this world better for all. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, for that important and also powerful message. Thank you very much. It is now time for our first session, Europe at its turning point, Beyond Conundrum Toward Prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats and allow us just a few minutes for preparations. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for waiting. We will now begin the session Europe at its turning point, Beyond Conundrum Toward Prosperity, with Mr. François Hollande, former President of France, and Mr. David Cameron, former Prime Minister of the UK, who is joining us online. Dr. Kang Kyung-hwa, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Korea, will moderate this session, so I will leave further introductions to our moderator. Dr. Kang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this opening plenary on Europe at its turning point, Beyond Conundrum Towards Prosperity. And this focus on Europe is, of course, very timely at this point. Much has been happening in Europe with far-reaching ramifications for the rest of the world. And of course, lately we've all been mourning the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Who has been such a gracious and dignified presence for 7 decades, not just for the people of the UK and the Commonwealth, but for countless admirers all around the world. And indeed, news of her demise has felt like the curtains coming down on an era. It has certainly been such to me. And the leaders of the world are now gathered in London for the funeral service for her, including former UK Prime Minister Mr. David Cameron, who joins us via online today. Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron, for joining us. I understand it's just after midnight or thereabouts in London, so thank you so much. And most of all, let me offer, on behalf of everybody here, our heartfelt condolences on the passing away of Her Majesty the Queen, and of course our very best wishes for the reign of King Charles III. Mr. Cameron, connecting with you there gives us a certain feeling of linking up to an extraordinary historical event. So before we get into the discussion, can I ask you briefly to share your thoughts on Her Majesty the Queen and her funeral today? Sir.
Well, thank you very much for your condolences, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. but thank you for what you said about Her Majesty. It's been a very sad day in Britain, but also a very beautiful day. There was something like 2 million people on the streets wanting to show their respect and their love and their admiration for Queen Elizabeth II. And it was nothing short of an outpouring of love, I think, right across the country, in respect of her more than 70 years on the throne. I mean, it was a privilege to be her 12th Prime Minister. She started with Winston Churchill. I was number 12. She had another 3 after that. And she was quite simply, I think, the world's greatest public servant. And I think this 10 days since her death has reminded us in the UK how lucky we were to have her, and how lucky we are to have a constitutional monarchy, someone who's our head of state, who's above politics, who brings the country together. And I think we've seen that on the streets of London today, as we saw right around the country with people mourning her loss. So we're coming to terms with what we've had and what we've lost, but I think King Charles III has made a very good start and has pledged to say that he'll be like his mother, he is to serve, and I'm sure he'll be good to his word. But it's been an extraordinary day here.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Cameron, for sharing those thoughts with us. I'm sure the Queen will be very proud to see all that has unfolded on the streets of London and indeed around the country during the past 11 days. And I'm sure we all wish her a good rest in peace. Now, turning to the war in Ukraine, of course, that has been at the center of our attention for much of the year. And how the war unfolds and ultimately ends will have definitive consequences not only for the prosperity and security of Europe, but also have huge implications for the rest of the world, of course, including those of us in Northeast Asia. And today, we are very privileged to have with us another eminent political leader of Europe, Mr. François Hollande, former president of France, to share his views about the developments in Europe and beyond at this very critical point in history. So, Mr. Hollande, the war in Ukraine now in its 7th month. I don't think anybody expected it to last this long, but the expectation now is that it will last much longer. Terrible prognosis for the people of Ukraine who've suffered already so much. But how do you see the war unfolding in the months ahead? Do you see any room to find the rationale on either side to stop the war, or even just to agree to a sustained ceasefire anytime soon?
Je voudrais d'abord saluer le président.
Well, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Chairman Chang De-hwan of the World Knowledge Forum. Through this opportunity, we are able to take a deep dive into global issues. And thank you for emphasizing the importance of freedom. I really relate to that. I would also like to send my greetings to Prime Minister Cameron. You are all the way in London, and I would like to share my condolences with you. I am sure that the whole world is in sadness with London, and we are joining you for all of these sentiments. France, a long time ago, did have our kings and queens. At that time, Queen Elizabeth always emphasized the importance of freedom, and we were always inspired by Her Majesty, and she has always been the center of democracy for countries around the world. We have our moderator, and Dr. Kang asked me about the war in Ukraine. As you have mentioned, Ukraine is a part of Europe, and we have never imagined that such a large-scale war would break out in modern Europe. But with the invasion from Russia, we always can see that they like to show their muscles. And this was true during the times of the former Soviet Union, and their exercise of power never really had any true direction. And so in February, when there was the invasion, I think Russia decided that all of the conditions for the invasion was in place, and Belarus and Kazakhstan were also being dominated by Russia. And Putin, it seems, worked with Azerbaijan, and he did provide a cause for conflicts there as well. Nevertheless, all of the thoughts of Putin, I believe, was focused on the fact that he believed that all of the conditions were favorable towards him. And I think he just probably decided that Europe would not respond as we did. But the results were very different. Unlike what he had expected, we did have a large surge of response from Europe. And currently, he is being pushed back, and the long is being prolonged for much longer than expected. Ukraine is becoming more aggressive in responding to the invasion of Russia. And so, in order to answer your question, I would like to mention that the war will continue in the next months. Putin currently is trying to protect the lines that he has set. And I think he's just trying to keep the status as it is. And without negotiations, I think the war will go into the winter. But on the other hand, we think that everyone is looking for a mediator. And we also do see some signs of preparation for negotiations. This will be a way for Putin to try and enlarge his dominance over Ukraine. His strategy is probably trying to expand his power to recover the land that he believes is Russia's towards the east and west, as well as possibly the south. But the people of Ukraine, they are being supported by Europe, including the UK and the US. And so they are in need of military support. Some military support is being provided, but if we have more efficient military support, possibly with massive provision of armory, then this could make the position of Ukraine more favorable, and I think that will make the war continue. So if we continue to provide weapons to Ukraine, and if the people of Ukraine continue to fight against Russia, and if we continue to see solidarity among nations, that will continue the war.
Global community, in particular the European solidarity, which in fact has been renewed by this war and has imposed a unified sanction on Russia. But that has also meant and resulted in a steep energy crisis and inflationary spirals for the economies of Europe. And the sanctions themselves do not seem to be having the intended result, which is to cripple the Russian war machinery and the Russian economy. Not in the short term anyway. But speaking of the winter months, obviously the energy crisis will steepen. The challenge will become greater in the winter months. But can the solidarity of Europe sustain itself as the cold months ahead deepens the energy crisis across the region? So briefly there, Mr. Hollande, and then we'll go to Mr. Cameron for his response on the question.
Les sanctions, c'est-à-dire à la fois d'infliger un embargo sur un certain nombre de produits.
Well, when we talk about sanctions, well, first of all, we have a ban on exports, and we also have bans on the leadership of Russia. And when we have these bans and sanctions, then it does also impact the countries that issue these sanctions, but it has a bigger impact on Russia. We talked about the energy crisis, the power crisis, and the gas crisis. All of these issues definitely are leading to higher inflation. But related to Russia, what we must understand is that sanctions, it can be very useful and influential because the Russian economy is going through difficulties currently. And if we take a look at electronic parts, if they ban the exports and if we ban exports, it could lead to impacting the production of weapons in Russia. And what Putin is mentioning is that liberal democracies are currently very vulnerable and very weak. That's the position of Putin. And he continues to emphasize this. And he also emphasizes that there is an energy crisis and inflation issue in liberal democracies. But the people of Russia are also being impacted by these issues. And so the ambition of Putin is to fragment Europe and also to have the sanctions against Russia lifted. Recently, there were elections in Sweden, and there is an election coming up in Italy. Through these elections, the ultra-right, we have to take a look at what their position will be through these elections. The solidarity of Europe is absolutely important, and the role of the UK is absolutely critical. Of course, the EU and the UK has very close ties, and so UK is definitely very important in this response.
Mr. Cameron?
I agree with a lot of what Francois has said. I think there are three things to remember when it comes to this conflict. First of all, it is so clear that it was Russian aggression and was completely unjustified. There are no shades of grey in this argument. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, a member of the United Nations. This invasion and occupation is illegal. Full stop, end of story. The second thing is, I think that Europe is very united over this issue, and NATO is very united. We've seen two new countries, Sweden and Finland, join NATO, making the organization stronger. And of course, sanctions take time to have an effect, but the long-term effect on Russia, I think, will be very bad for them as Europe stops relying on Russian gas and Russian oil, and as far as we can see, supplying essential weapons and things like that to Russia. But nonetheless, I think countries all over the world should look at the clarity of this situation and look at the Chinese response and see that they're not fulfilling what Ban Ki-moon said about neutrality not being an option. And I think it has a great relevance to your region and what happens in the Indo-Pacific and in Northeast Asia, which is we are seeing a more aggressive China in lots of circumstances against lots of countries, whether it's the arguments they've had with Australia or with Lithuania, or arguments they've had around issues in the South China Sea. And China seems to have changed its approach from one where, I think it was the words of Deng, of bide your time and hide your strength. They don't seem to be taking that approach anymore. And I think that has consequences. I'm all for us having a cooperative relationship with China where we can. We must cooperate over climate change. We should try to cooperate over trade. But there are some areas where clearly we're not going to agree, and we have to have a relationship where we're frank and honest and strong and robust about those issues. And I'm sure that has consequences for countries in your region, where I think there'll be a need for greater working together of the democracies in East Asia to make sure that they are not picked off and bullied individually by China.
Mr. Hollande?
Depuis 10 ans, Xi Jinping et Vladimir.
As you may know, President Xi and President Putin have formed an alliance, so to speak. This is not something that we expected initially at the beginning of the war, but it has become very clear that the relationship between Xi and Putin has been strengthened. And so this alliance between China and Russia is something that we're witnessing, and in addition, China and Russia are thinking that the West is declining and the Western liberal democracies are declining. That's what they're thinking, as far as I understand. And recently, at the UN Security Council, Russia and China have been speaking from the same positions. And also, there has been increasing trade between Russia and China. And furthermore, there are military actions taken jointly by Russia and China. So initially, at the beginning of the war, China was rather surprised that Putin decided to invade Ukraine. So that was the initial surprise and the reaction from China in the beginning. But China is still siding with Russia. China is not losing its relations with Russia. And at the same time, there are gas supplies from Russia to China that Europe is not receiving. And for the past several months, what we're experiencing is that there are many trade activities going on between Russia and China as we speak. I believe that China is observing the situation and it is looking for any situations where that may be more favorable to China. So they're looking for some situations developing in Europe and in Ukraine that may be in favor of China. In other words, even if Russia loses this war, China is trying to take advantage of the situation and gain more from this war. Now, when it comes to the alliance between China and Russia, it is obvious that China is putting its national interest first, and China is holding the upper hand while Russia is sort of subordinate, in a sense, to China's influence. Now, when we look at the situations surrounding the Taiwan Strait, if Russia loses the war, then the situation around the Taiwan Strait will become even more complicated. Currently, there are sanctions imposed on Russia, and China is observing the kinds of impact the sanctions are having on Russia. But as you mentioned, Mr. Cameron, the Russian economy is rather small in scale, and the Chinese economy is much bigger. So I believe that China is examining and studying the situation in Europe and is trying to learn from this war so that they can have more benefits from the situation. And if Russia wins the war, then China will accept that consequence and we'll be able to see that Russia was able to do that, and China would also be able to do something similar to what Putin has done.
Indeed. How it unfolds and how it concludes will have huge repercussions all over the world and in this part of the world also. But even before Ukraine, global politics has been realigning, and China has been a big part of that. Global trade also has been realigning, driven by the rivalry between the United States and China, and the supply chain disruptions that has been aggravated by the pandemic response. And certainly the war has deepened this trend. And certainly for countries near China, Korea included, this is a very uncomfortable situation. For Korea, China is our #1 trading partner. The United States is our #2. But the United States is also our one security ally. So we have a complex set of foreign policy and security issues that we need to juggle and deal with on the table. We don't like the idea of choosing, but you seem to suggest, and Mr. Cameron also seemed to suggest, that the choice is becoming inevitable for liberal democracies. Is that so clearly so? Or is there another way to this, which is, for example, countries, like-minded liberal democracies like Korea and many countries of Europe, creating a zone of cooperation, perhaps short of an alliance, but a zone of cooperation that provides a counterweight or a countermeasure to this inevitable choice. Mr. Orlon?
Si nous entrons dans une logique de bloc,
we are discussing this notion of bloc formation around the world. We have Iran and China and Russia on one hand, and on the other hand, we have Western countries and like-minded countries, including the US. And we also have Korea and other European countries. And when these blocs are forming, there is a big dilemma that these countries will be situated in. As you mentioned, we have Korea is close to China geographically, and China is Korea's #1 trading partner, as the moderator mentioned. And China also needs Korea for its economy and trade. But at the same time, Korea is relying on the US for security, and Korea is also a liberal democracy, so it needs support from other like-minded countries in the West. But when we think about this country, China, I believe that China is in the process of making some calculations, is being hesitant. If you go a little too far, then you may lose some economic interests. And when you think about the rivalry and competition between the US and China, the situation is rather tricky. And when you look at the Chinese economy, it is affected by the pandemic and the rising inflation around the world. So there are many negative factors affecting the Chinese economy. But at the same time, the Chinese government has the obligation to bring about prosperity for the Chinese people, and that is why China seems to be making some calculations whether to make aggressive moves in the Taiwan Strait or not, and what kinds of consequences such action will bring about, and this may have a negative impact on China's interests. And at the party congress in China, I understand that there are discussions on these potential calculations. But I believe that we need to take a look at the strategic direction that China may be taking. They may choose to become a military power while sacrificing some of the economic interests, or they may choose to weaken their military influence while maximizing economic prosperity. And in this situation, countries, including Korea and other like-minded countries, they need to cooperate and they need to pursue co-prosperity.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
Well, the point I would make is that in many ways, the situation with Ukraine and what happened with COVID, both those events, I think, teach us many of the same lessons. Lesson one is we have to become more resilient in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our trading links, in terms of our energy and food security. That whole issue of the resilience of our countries is going to become more important. The next point is far more emphasis on security, not just defense and national security, but food security, energy security. And also it makes us think about our alliances in a dangerous world where something like the invasion of Ukraine can happen, and with a more muscular and aggressive China, we have to think about who our real friends and who our allies are and how we can work together. I mean, you ask whether Korea has to make a choice. I mean, when it comes to your security, when it comes to your allies and countries that are like-minded, when it comes to sharing expertise on things like cybersecurity and issues like that, I mean, clearly, I would argue the best choice is to work with like-minded democracies that believe in freedom, believe in the rule of law, believe in the things that in Korea has made you successful and in Europe has made us successful. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't trade with China. Yes, we need to ask ourselves, are we over-reliant for certain substances or materials from either Russia or China? But it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean the retreat from globalization has to become a rout. We should continue to trade and work with China, but we're going to have to take greater care about our overall levels of resilience. Look, it makes no sense for us to try and drive China and Russia together. We don't want that to happen. I think Russia has become a pariah because of this invasion and should be treated like a pariah. and we must keep these sanctions in place and not become reliant again on their oil and gas and learn those lessons for the future. But we want to make sure there's a choice for China not to team up with this illegal occupation of Ukraine and to try and obey the rules and norms of international institutions. I'm sure we'll see many companies saying, well, am I over-reliant on China? Should I do more business in Korea, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in other countries in East Asia? I'm sure that will happen, and sensible that should happen. But as I say, let's see a more realistic globalization, a more resilient globalization, but we don't want to see a rout, a mass retreat from globalization. That would make us poorer. I mean, we should celebrate the fact that when Francois and I were around the table in the European Union and we signed the free trade agreement with the Republic of Korea, trade between Europe, including Britain and Korea, has gone up 50%. Free trade is still a great engine for growth and progress. And between like-minded countries like ours, it's clearly the right answer, and there's more that can be done.
Indeed. Speaking of trade, Europe is our number 3rd trading partner overall. And after Brexit, I think Korea was one of the first countries to sign a bilateral trade agreement with the UK so that we preserve the excellent economic cooperation that was fostered with the UK under the Korea-EU free trade agreement. And I think on the economic cooperation side, prosperity side, there is no question that this tie between Korea and the European countries will continue to strengthen despite the challenges of the inflationary spirals and the disruptions in the supply chain. But getting back to your focus on security, is there room, are there specific avenues for further cooperation between Europe and the Republic of Korea on the security side of things? Security in the broader sense, not just the traditional security issue. May we start with you, Mr. Roland?
La guerre en Ukraine a provoqué un choc.
Well, the war in Ukraine shocked all of us. And if we take a look at the topic today, it's super compensation. And I think this is a great reminder for all of us. I'm sure that Prime Minister Cameron remembers this. For the EU member states, it's very difficult to ask the member states to have a commitment for security. Well, for national defense, we usually earmark about 2% of the GDP, but not all of the member states agree to this. If we talk about Ukraine, well, we have new members for NATO, and of course it's important to strengthen NATO. And we also have to think about the security relations between the US and Europe. It's very important to have strong security alliances between the two regions. And we also have to think about a country like Germany. For example, Germany actually earmarks 100 billion euros for their national security. But if we take a look at overall Europe, the national defense industry is an industry that needs to be maintained, but we need more cooperation for that. Let me now talk about our relationship with Korea. Well, what we wish to see, first of all, is Korea, because it's so equipped with great technologies, we could collaborate for satellites, missiles, ballistic missiles, and cybersecurity. These are some areas for cooperation that could be open to Korea and Europe. And if we talk about some bilateral ties, I think we could have some bilateral cooperation. And I think there could be some direct forms of cooperation. For example, cooperation between NATO member states and Korea. In the case of Korea, as you're very, very well aware, there is always this potential conflict on the Korean Peninsula, which I don't need to elaborate on. And so for the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, cooperation is very important. I need to raise an important question. In protecting ourselves, especially against the attack of others, will we be protected by the U.S.? We have to ask this fundamental question. If we take a look at the war in Ukraine, the position of the U.S. shows us, and depending on the election results of the U.S., there could be changes in their foreign policies. And whenever elections come around, we always have these predictions about what will happen to their international relations after the elections. I think this is the same for Europe and Korea.
On that question of...
I think the last point Francois made is important. I mean, right now, the United States policy towards Ukraine is succeeding because they've given them effective weaponry. The Ukrainians are beating back the Russians, and President Biden has a foreign policy success on his hands. So you would expect him to reinforce that policy, and you'll see further support from America for Ukraine. But the point Francois makes is important, and important, I think, for the Republic of Korea. You know, we saw with the Trump presidency that you can get quite a big change in policy, and the United States can become a less reliable ally. I think you saw that in Korea with everything that he said and did. And I think that emphasizes the importance of potential partnerships and actual partnerships between South Korea and Europe and NATO and the United Kingdom. There already is a NATO partnership with the Republic of Korea, and I think it's getting deeper. It covers things like cybersecurity and training and other things. And of course, the Korean military made a great contribution in helping in Afghanistan. So I would like to see that strengthened. I think that's an important thing to do. I applaud the fact that Korea is investing in its own defense industry. You have great companies, great technology, and actually investing in your own defense equipment and expertise, I think, is important for yourselves, but also will have benefits for other countries too. On this issue, though, of whether there should be deeper partnerships, I mean, ultimately it is an issue for countries like Korea and countries in your neighborhood to decide whether you want to do more, not to create a fully fledged NATO perhaps, but just to have a greater sense of alliances of democracies that want to work together and want to share expertise and strengthen their defenses together. There's no doubt we live in a more dangerous world today than when Francois and I were running our respective countries. And that is going to mean more investment in defense. We're doing it in Europe. I know you're doing it in Korea. It's going to be more emphasis on alliances. And I think more work with the Americans to make sure that they see that we are investing alongside them. I disagree with almost everything Donald Trump said, apart from one thing, when he said that Europe needed to pay more towards its own defense. And that is now happening. You're seeing France and Britain have always been at 2% or so of our national economy invested in defense, but you're seeing other countries, particularly Germany, investing more. And that is the price of freedom. You have to have strong defenses and make sure other democracies have strong defenses in this more dangerous world. And of course, we did a lot to help Ukraine after 2014. Britain trained 20,000 Ukrainian service personnel. But of course, if we'd done even more, and if other countries had done even more, then Russia would have found it even more difficult to launch this invasion. And that's a very big lesson, I think, which we should never forget, that strong defense and being prepared to defend yourself is a vital price that you pay for freedom.
Well, I think if I could sum that up, resilience, your own defense capability to strengthen that and to strengthen regional cooperation with your neighbors, and to reach out further across the region to like-minded partners in Europe and elsewhere. And of course, I cannot end this session without talking about climate change, because Europe has been the leader in the Paris Accord, which was under your presidency, Mr. President, and COP26, which was, very fruitful under the chairmanship of the UK. Now we are preparing for COP27, but there's not much talk about climate change as the war in Ukraine has been consuming our attention. But how do we get climate change back on? And it is urgent. This is an existential crisis for humanity. How do we put this back on the front burner at the top of our agenda? How does Europe take the leadership back on the issue of climate change? Mr. Hollande, and I'll give briefly to Mr. Cameron.
Monsieur Ban Ki-moon est intervenu tout à l'heure et il est...
Well, we did hear from Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and during COP26, he played a pivotal role. Global warming is definitely something that we could have improved if everybody had kept to their commitment. It is currently a very urgent crisis indeed. But despite so, not all of the pledges are being put into action. And it seems that there is more carbon emission than expected despite the pandemic. In 2030 to 2040, we need to maintain global warming to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is very urgent. Well, the Ukrainian situation is aggravating the situation because without the provision of gas, some countries will have no choice but to turn to coal-based generation. And in China, we are seeing that they are also starting the operation of old coal power plants. And coal power plants could be good for energy supply, but it is a very bad choice for Earth. We need to accelerate the transition of energy sources. If we take a look at the prices of gas and oil, it is skyrocketing, and so we do need to make more efforts for transition to renewables. That is what we need to do at this point in time. For the renewables, are they actually relevant? Are investments into renewables actually efficient? We need to research this and support this. Whenever there is a crisis, we always see that there is this surge of common agenda. And so we need to focus on saving energy and maintain a momentum to reduce carbon emissions. For countries around the world, we see that the younger generation is leading us to this direction, and they are pressuring the older generation to make the right choice because they are very concerned about the climate. And I hope that we can maintain this climate action.
On climate change?
Well, I think the first thing is, you're right, we should make this an issue of resilience. I mean, if we invest more in nuclear, we have secure energy and no carbon emissions. If we invest more in offshore wind, as we did in Britain, we've got the biggest offshore wind market in the world, you get more energy and no carbon emissions. So we've got to keep making the long-term argument for nuclear and renewables and for a transition to net zero, because that's in our long-term interest. I think you asked whether Europe can do more to lead. I mean, I would turn it round and say, what more can we do? Countries like Britain have already committed to net zero. I tell my children that our carbon emissions aren't lower than 1988, they're lower than 1888. So there's only a certain amount more that we can do. And in fact, I would argue, and do argue strongly, against the green movement here in Europe, that we should still exploit our remaining gas fields. because the alternative to doing that is importing gas from Qatar or importing gas from Mozambique, where it's coming halfway across the world. So you can use it as a transitional fuel to get to net zero. I'm still an optimist. If all of the G20 meet their nationally determined contributions, then that would get you 3/4 of the way to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. So it can be done. Francois did a fabulous job in Paris. I think we did well in Glasgow. And I think the key is to make sure the countries that aren't contributing properly do contribute. And secondly, to make this about specifics. One of the successes at Glasgow was there was a very big focus on 4 things: on coal, on cash for developing countries, on planting trees, and on electric cars. You've got to turn global climate change from the general to the specific to make a success of these conferences. It can be done. Europe is leading the way already. It's really for the countries that have not made the contributions. And in Britain, we've definitely shown you can invest in renewables and nuclear to make a big difference. And we need to do more of that, and others need to catch up. But it's a resilience issue now. It's a security issue. It's not just about climate and the environment. It's actually about safety and security as well. And I think that will perhaps help politicians around the world to make this vital argument.
Well, yes, but I think the developing countries will still say, yes, there is more that the developed country can do, and which is the discussions on climate financing. That's
I mentioned cash. I think,
yes.
The money,
yes.
that's very important.
Very,
Rich
very
countries,
important.
even if they've got their own plans for net zero,
Yes.
they've got to provide the finance for developing countries that need to both mitigate and also adapt to climate change that's already happening. Britain is certainly doing our part, but others need to do that too, and there's still a shortfall in that department.
Well, I think this conference theme, the concept of super compensation, to apply that to a world that's in a disarray, to put it mildly, fragmenting, dividing, what element or what catalyst do you think, if you can name just one thing, that might put us on a super compensatory track towards recovery and larger freedom? Very briefly, Mr. President.
Si nous pensons que les crises nous rendent meilleurs, alors nous allons être parfaits.
Well, we are faced with a crisis, but we can become even stronger as we overcome this crisis. And in our past history, we have endured many crises, and we were able to emerge stronger from these crises. So we may be able to do that as well this time. And I would like to argue that we should respect sovereignty of the independent states. And we really need to make sure that sovereign states are guaranteed their independence and their own rights, and only then we can achieve super compensation. And we also need to expand our horizon and our perspectives, because a locally taken action may have global consequences and global impact. So you should not just think about your own interests, but also think about the mutual interests and the global interests. And that should be the ways of thinking in your decision-making process. In other words, countries should stop just pursuing their own national interests. They should open up their doors. If they continue to close their doors and pursue their own interests only, then we may end up lose altogether. We need to be stronger together, and we need to be able to defend ourselves, and at the same time, we need to contribute to global prosperity together.
I think the short answer is that the super compensation that we might get from this world of crisis is greater collaboration between like-minded countries, and particularly the democracies. If I think of all the crises we've had to face in the last 20 years, the crisis of terrorism, the crisis of the financial collapse, the crisis of COVID, the crisis of Ukraine, they all point towards greater collaboration, particularly amongst countries that share the same values and outlooks and approach. And of course, with Ban Ki-moon in the audience, I would love that to be through the United Nations, but sometimes it won't be. And sometimes we're going to have to create new institutions and new ways of working. Gavi is a great example, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization. We've immunized children all over the world, not through a UN program, but through countries coming together and acting together and working together. And I think that could be the super compensation. Countries like the Republic of Korea and France and Britain, we're on other sides of the world, but we are so similar. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in democracy. We know that our prosperity is based on trade and markets and entrepreneurialism. We even love playing rugby, and we have many other things in common. We should use those things to collaborate, to work together to solve these problems, knowing that when you have politicians and countries with the same values, you can work together fast and find solutions.
Thank you very much, sir. I think the huge response that Korean pop culture is getting in France, in the UK, and many countries in Europe certainly underscore that common
We're now
spirit.
all watching Korean television as well as listening to Korean music.
Yes.
I know you like a lot of English music and television there, so that's
Yes.
another thing we have in common.
Yes, I think that the commonality of that spontaneous free spirit that comes out of these creations is what binds us even closer together. So, Mr. Roland, any final comments before we close the session?
Oui, d'abord, j'étais très heureux de retrouver.
First of all, I would like to say that it is my great pleasure to be sitting with former Prime Minister Cameron, even though you're joining us online. And I believe that we can pull our wisdom together and overcome the current challenges. We are all liberal democracies. And sometimes we wonder how strong the foundation of democracy is when we are faced with crises. We may be shaken and our core values may be threatened. But once again, we are reminded of the value of these core values that we uphold together. And when liberal democracies, they are up against nationalism, we have always won victory in our history. So we're proud of being a democracy and we need to protect that.
Final words?
I think that is right. When countries in Europe have stood together in defense of sovereignty and democracy, we've succeeded. I think the Ukraine crisis is proving that NATO is much stronger than people perhaps thought. And so if good can come out of these current difficulties, it's this sense that there is such a thing as collective action and collective security and like-minded countries working together. And I think we can apply that not just to the issue of Ukraine, we can apply it to the other key things we face about resilience and security and the difficulties of handling a more aggressive and assertive China. I think it's the same thought process. It can lead to different approaches, but it's the right thought process. How do we work together, particularly with those who share our values?
Well, thank you, sir, Mr. Cameron, Mr. Hollande. It's been a great honor for me to be moderating this discussion with the two of you. Much food for thought and much elements for the further discussion at this World Knowledge Forum this year. So thank you very much for kickstarting this forum in a very enriching and enlightening manner. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent session that touched upon various challenges that the global community is now facing. Thank you very much, Monsieur Hollande, Mr. Cameron, and of course, Dr. Kang Kyung-hwa. Ladies and gentlemen, please give our moderator and speakers another round of applause. Thank you very much. Let's take a moment to rearrange the stage for our next session. We will begin our next session very soon, so please bear with us. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to continue with a special video message from Crown Prince Frederik of Denmark about commitment for climate action, one of the most important and pressing issues of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, please refer to the screen. Let's take a listen.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, leaders of the public and private sectors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation. Although I'm unable to attend in person, I'm delighted to virtually follow in the footsteps of the many world leaders who have previously opened the World Knowledge Forum. The COVID-19 pandemic resembles the challenges presented by climate change and shares many features. They disrupt our way of life and threaten our livelihood. They have far-reaching short and long-term consequences to every part of our societies. And they are problems of a global scale that cannot be addressed by one nation alone. Fortunately, fighting the pandemic has provided valuable lessons. We saw the public and private sectors of the world come together at an unprecedented speed to learn, to innovate, to share knowledge, and to cooperate, enabling us to swiftly tackle this global crisis in the most efficient way possible. The same approach can be applied to mitigate climate change. We must remember that now going green is no longer a luxury, it is a necessity. Today, I stand here before you as patron of State of Green, which is an organization dedicated to sharing Denmark's green solutions and experiences with the goal of accelerating the green transition worldwide. Known to punch above our weight, as a country, our ambitions have led us to become a giant in the world's renewable energy sector. I believe our journey for a greener tomorrow, which began out of necessity, can offer inspiration. When the oil crisis hit in the 1970s, we realized we needed to transform our energy system to be more independent and sustainable. With firm political leadership and businesses rising to the challenge by seeking new opportunities, we became the first nation to successfully commercialize offshore wind, trailblazing green transition at an industrial scale and creating new world markets. Denmark has been able to successfully decouple its CO2 emissions and economic growth. Since the 1980s, our national GDP has doubled, while energy consumption has been almost constant. On average, roughly 50% of our daily electricity needs are met through wind energy. On windy days, we even export to our neighboring countries, and more than 73,000 people hold jobs created by the green economy, and the green technology sector accounts for 7% of our exports. The numbers speak for themselves. Going green is not just the right thing to do for the environment and the energy security, it is also great business. With the current global green crisis, spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many nations today face the same problem that Denmark did in the 70s and 80s. The solution remains the same: clean, green, renewable energy. However, as climate technology has evolved dramatically and because it is continuing to advance as we speak, it will not take you as long as it took Denmark to see the results. Cooperation is key in the Danish model. Finance, business, technology, politics, academia, and civil society all have a role to play in taking on this daunting task. And climate change cannot be solved by one nation alone. We can only live up to the ambition of the Paris Agreement by sharing best practices, experiences, and technology. Today's World Knowledge Forum in Seoul is addressing this very point. You are gathered here to share knowledge on how businesses, industries, systems, and societies may change for a better tomorrow. And reports show that mitigating climate change will be one of the greatest tasks of our lifetime. It is on our shoulders to find a way to bounce back from the setbacks caused by the pandemic and to create a healthier, more sustainable world while not leaving anybody behind. It is a Herculean task, but also a great opportunity to share our knowledge and together create the basis of a sustainable future. I hope you will find inspiration in this year's Knowledge Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Crown Prince of Frederick, Denmark, for that meaningful message. Thank you once again. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin a special dialogue with former White House National Security Advisor, Mr. John Bolton. It's titled China in East Asia After the Russia-Ukraine War. Mr. Chun Young-woo, Chairman and founder of Korean Peninsula Future Forum, will serve as moderator for this session. Please welcome them with a big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
May I begin? Well, Ambassador John Bolton, welcome to Korea. And
glad to be here.
I'm honored to be moderator of this session, and I thank you for honoring this forum with your presence. I see no need for introduction for Ambassador John Bolton. His latest book, The Room Where It Happened, drew a huge interest in Korea as elsewhere. I think reading your book, I thought that your job as a national security advisor for President Trump was the most difficult and most stressful job in the world. And I thought that my job as a national security advisor for President Lee Myung-bak was maybe among the easiest jobs in the world.
It's pretty stressful here in Korea, too.
So your book, I thought, could be a textbook for those students who study international relations, who study American foreign policy and decision-making in the U.S. foreign policy.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. As you may be aware, you are as controversial and divisive a figure in Korea as in the U.S. and elsewhere. So
see what we can do today.
Yeah, you are a hero for those who support your principled approach to North Korea and denuclearization, and your steadfast advocacy of regime change and preemptive strike in North Korea. But there are others who see you as a terminator, a spoiler of a deal, a villain who is accountable for the fiasco of the Hanoi summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, thus missing a historic opportunity to make peace with North Korea and for peaceful denuclearization of North Korea. But if you look at the proposal that Kim Jong-un came up with in Hanoi, it is to, his proposal is to shut down the Yongbyon complex in return for the repeal of all major crippling sanctions in place at the time. And in substance, what his proposal means is to expand nuclear arsenal he already has, but at a slower pace by keeping the enrichment facilities outside Yongbyon up and running. So I thought this was an outrageous proposal. But even without your presence in Hanoi to advise President Trump, is it conceivable that Trump could be played and fooled by Kim Jong-un into accepting such an outrageous deal?
Well, I think it's entirely possible to be fooled by the North Koreans, as the United States and South Korea have been fooled repeatedly for over 3 decades. The world's only hereditary communist dictatorship, just think about that for a minute, a hereditary communist dictatorship has multiple times in the past 3 decades committed to give up nuclear weapons. It's very easy for them to make that commitment. They just never seem to follow through on it. And that's the problem. The idea that they make some steps toward ending the nuclear weapons program in exchange for release of sanctions, provision of economic benefits as under the agreed framework, whatever it may be, front ends the benefits that North Korea gets. And with the fragile economy of that country, getting a lifeline like that at the beginning of implementation gives them much more than we obtained by small initial steps toward denuclearization, especially given that the government in Pyongyang never proceeds beyond that. This is a government that has lied consistently for decades about its nuclear work. It has concealed its activities. It has engaged in terrorist acts around the world. It's not a regime not only that can be trusted, but a regime that has shown no sign whatever that it truly wants to give up nuclear weapons. And that's the fundamental problem with it. We've negotiated in different forms with North Korea for 30 years. And what is the result of 3 decades of negotiation? They've exploded 6 nuclear devices.
So you have been saying that North Korea was going to sell the same horse, not only twice, but 3, 4 times, the same horse all the time. I suppose that North Korea is capable of selling this, not only the same live horse, but I think they are capable of selling a dead horse also. But do you believe that ROK government at the time, Moon Jae-in administration, was behind Kim Jong-un's proposal when he came up with such a deal that could not be acceptable to the Trump administration, even without your advice?
Well, I don't know if it was the Moon government that suggested it or people in the U.S. State Department who suggested it, but it was a very bad idea. And I think what happened in Hanoi was that Kim Jong-un went in confident that he would get U.S. agreement to his proposal. And he was stunned when he found out that Trump wasn't going to give him that agreement. So he had some basis to believe, erroneously as it turned out, that he would be successful diplomatically. And, whatever the basis was, he turned out to be wrong, fortunately. But I think that, focusing on the Hanoi negotiations or the failure in Hanoi is a mistake for 2 reasons. Number one, what I used to say was, I'm the national security advisor. I'm not the national security decision maker. So whether I was there or not, I don't think fundamentally made any difference. But I think the broader lesson to learn is the failed effort to deal with nuclear proliferation by endless negotiation. Much of what we say about North Korea, much of their progress toward the capability of having deliverable nuclear weapons, we could say about Iran too. Year after year after year of them promising to do things that they never have any intention of doing. In the 1930s, Winston Churchill once described this phenomenon as representing the confirmed unteachability of mankind. That when it's possible to take steps early at a lower risk and a lower cost to end the problem, we don't do it. And now we're faced with a North Korea that has a new capability to detonate nuclear devices. We don't know yet what their delivery system capability is. And an Iran that continues to make day-by-day progress towards that same capability. The world is becoming less safe because we have collectively, but I will say it here if nowhere else, because the United States has failed to stop the proliferators before we got to that point.
So you are now exonerated from the responsibility of fiasco in
Look, I'd love to take credit for what happened in Hanoi. I think it made the world a safer place.
Yeah. So let's make it clear that you are not responsible for.
But I give credit to President Trump for not agreeing to Kim's proposal.
Kim Jong-un is responsible for the failure for bringing a wrong proposal. Let me put it that way. When North Korea conducted their first nuclear test in 2006, you were ambassador to the UN, I remember, and I think you deserve an intellectual property right for coining the term CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, and also including CVID as legal obligation for North Korea, and by inserting that in the Security Council Resolution 1718. So after North Korea abrogated NPT, North Korea was forced to accept more onerous non-proliferation obligation than the NPT, and I think that was your contribution to restoring or to strengthening a special, an ad hoc international legal regime that would be binding on North Korea alone. And do you believe there is still a chance to achieve a CVID? And do you believe that preemptive strikes and regime change are still viable solutions for North Korean nuclear problem and fundamental problem of North Korea itself?
Well, I think for the United States, it's the fundamental obligation of the government to protect the people from dangers posed by governments like North Korea with its desire to have deliverable nuclear weapons. And to the extent that the innocent civilians in our country are held hostage to rogue regimes like the one in Pyongyang, we have failed as representatives of the government, when we're in government, to protect the people. So it would be a dereliction of duty to give up options to protect our civilian population. Would any government of South Korea give up a mechanism to protect the people of South Korea? I don't think so. And I don't think anybody should expect the United States to behave any differently. I would say right now, the path that we should pursue is to break the bubble that we've lived in for at least 20 years in believing that China is neutral on North Korea's nuclear weapons program. In the six-party talks and other fora, we took China's word that they didn't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. That they worried about it too, and we should all get together and find a common solution to this common problem. I don't think that was their view then. I certainly don't think it's their view now. As the Beijing government gets more belligerent, more assertive all along the Indo-Pacific periphery, North Korea becomes a card for them to play against Japan, South Korea, the United States, in some respects against Taiwan. Just as the card they play against Taiwan has implications elsewhere along that periphery. I think the United States should lay responsibility for North Korea's nuclear weapons program and the responsibility to stop it where it belongs, which is in Beijing. Without Beijing's support for North Korea, the regime could not last. And I don't think that Beijing is neutral on the question. I don't think they really seriously believe that they would be worse off if North Korea's nuclear program ended. So the agenda between the United States and China is already pretty full, but I would put North Korea right at the center of it. Because if China is not willing to do what they alone have the unique capability of doing to restrain North Korea, then the only other alternative is that Kim Jong-un reaches the objective that he and his father and grandfather have been seeking these many years, and then the world becomes much less safe. Because then North Korea has the power to leverage deliverable nuclear weapons to achieve its objectives in Northeast Asia or beyond. And that leaves all of us in greater jeopardy.
As you mentioned, the latest developments in East Asia and Europe do not seem conducive to peace on the Korean Peninsula or denuclearization of North Korea. It could further complicate international efforts in that regard. For one thing, as you mentioned, U.S. and China are locked in head-to-head geopolitical competition with no end in sight. So the Korean Peninsula is not uppermost in their minds, and their highest priority is to build coalitions to contain and counter each other. As such, China seems, as you said, more interested in embracing North Korea as key partner in anti-US coalition rather than cooperating with the US for denuclearization. That's one bad news. Another is that North Korea went out of its way to become one of only 4 member states of the UN to vote against UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is very unusual because traditionally North Korea stood ferociously against any aggression on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of smaller states by bigger powers. And according to the US government sources, North Korea is even supplying rockets and artillery shells to Russia to support their military campaign in Ukraine. Through such unreserved support for Russia's act of aggression, North Korea secured an ironclad insurance policy in the form of Russia's veto against any additional Security Council sanctions, whatever North Korea chooses to do in terms of provocations in order to upgrade and expand its nuclear arsenal. And my question is, do you believe that North Korea's support for North Korea's aggression on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity could be utilized for legitimizing any future U.S. military action against North Korea in case U.S. Has to consider such an option?
Well, I don't believe anything the government of North Korea says to begin with. So their positions, I think, are entirely opportunistic, and the justification for the use of military force based on self-defense is part of the UN Charter in Article 51, and I think that includes preventive self-defense as well, because I don't think we're obligated to be subjected to a nuclear salvo by anybody before we act in self-defense. But I think North Korea's behavior shows that it has contempt for its adversaries. They think they can engage in these actions without any cost, with impunity. And I think the recent example of the decision to sell artillery pieces and ammunition is very instructive in a number of ways. Even China, apparently, as far as we know, as far as our intelligence tells us, has not transferred weapons to Russia, but North Korea is. And that is another fundamental problem with the threat of nuclear proliferation. I understand here on the Korean Peninsula, the focus is what North Korea will do here in Japan or maybe to the United States. But remember the other threat of proliferation by nuclear weapon states, that North Korea, which will sell anything to anybody for hard currency, would transfer nuclear devices to terrorist groups or other rogue states for use elsewhere in the world, which is something I think we should pay a lot more attention to and be a lot more worried about. It's the possession of the technology and the capability that makes them a global threat, not just a threat in Northeast Asia. And I do think that they have cast their lot with the emerging Chinese-Russian entente, which includes very likely Iran. So all the rogue states now are getting together, and it is part of a larger concern I think we should have, especially with China, throughout the rest of the century.
North Korea People's Assembly passed a new legislation, I think it was last week, to justify the first use, the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. So it's a kind of nuclear doctrine, legislation in North Korea. Do you think that makes any difference? Because without legislation, we could easily assume that North Korea would, when necessary, use nuclear weapons in a preemptive manner. So the fact that they made it into a law, North Korean law, in a way clears any controversy in this country about whether North Korea's nuclear weapons are to deter U.S. aggression, and there are people who argue that North Korean nuclear weapons are not for use against ROK. So this is not something that we should worry about. What the Americans should worry about. But the new legislation, in a way, defies all those arguments who advocated or who were condoning North Korea's nuclear armament. So you think that the new law makes any difference?
Well, I think what they've announced reflects what their policy has been for a long time. They have now made it express and made it public, which is really, in some senses, fairly daring for them to do, but which in another sense reflects the contempt that they have for the rest of us. That they just announce exactly what their plans are and expect no response. I think the nuclear weapons, people have said, as you mentioned, that for many years, this applies in the case of Iran as well, that they just need nuclear weapons because they're threatened by the United States' hostile policy. So it's purely defensive. And if we could only assure them that we don't bear them hostile intent, they'll happily give up their nuclear weapons. I mean, that theory's been there for 30 years. It's been wrong for 30 years. Our diplomacy based on it has been wrong for 30 years. And the result of the theory is both of them, North Korea has nuclear capabilities, Iran is getting closer to it. And that's the risk of this continued effort to talk them out of doing something that they clearly think is in their own national interest to do it. It's not for defensive purposes in the case of Pyongyang. It's for offensive purposes. They want Korean reunification on their terms. And the use of the nuclear weapons first is as leverage over the United States and others. Comes the day when there's an American president who hears North Korea say, get your troops out of South Korea, or you will be subject to nuclear weapons. Your bases will be subject to nuclear attack. A weak American president could say, okay, we're gone. The same leverage could be used to get American forces out of Japan. This is, I think, the logic that really underlies why North Korea wants nuclear weapons, the same logic that underlies why Iran wants them, not for defensive purposes, but to help establish Iranian hegemony in the Middle East and within the Islamic world. They want the capability to help advance their interests, not simply for protection. And until we break through that fundamental conceptual error, we will continue to follow policies that bring both of these rogue states closer to a nuclear weapons capability.
So by coming out on their long-standing policy on the use of nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un is doing a service for us. So that will leave no illusions on under what circumstances he could use nuclear weapons. And I should applaud him. I should applaud him for his honesty in declaring what he will do with nuclear weapons.
As I say, it's because he holds us in contempt, and because there are many people who will cling to their illusions, notwithstanding he's putting it right in their face.
But in a way, that could legitimize preemptive strike by other countries who feel threatened by a preemptive strike against North Korean nuclear facilities, for those who feel threatened by North Korean nuclear arsenal. So that's the downside, that's the risk that Kim Jong-un is taking by officializing his doctrine of offensive use of nuclear weapons.
Well, I think the North Koreans have one advantage in doing that Iran does not have, because in this part of the world, there's no Israel. Iran has to worry about Israel in many respects, but the North Koreans feel that they're immune from it, and that's why they act as blatantly as they do.
Now, turning to the broader region beyond the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia is now fraught with a great anxiety about danger of a military conflict to be triggered by miscalculation, bravado, or egos of political leaders. And there is no shortage of flashpoints. Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, Senkaku or Daoyu. And U.S. has been maintaining strategic ambiguity about whether it should defend Taiwan when it's invaded by China. So strategic ambiguity has been the consistent policy of the U.S. based on one China policy. Do you think that when Taiwan declares independence and China takes it as a red line, a casus belli, and decides to invade Taiwan. Do you think that U.S. will go to war with China over Taiwan? Is that something that we have to worry about?
Well, let me try and address a number of questions that are implicit in what you're asking. First off, I don't think Taiwan needs to declare independence to get China's attention. Taiwan is independent. Taiwan is a functioning, independent country and has been for quite some time. Its people pick their own leaders. And in fact, if you look at a survey that a major Taiwanese university has done every year for the past 30 years, they ask citizens on Taiwan, how do you see yourself? Are you Taiwanese? Are you Chinese? Or are you Taiwanese Chinese? And you'll forgive me because I don't have these figures exact, but the numbers are something like this. Over this 30-year period, the number of people who have identified as Chinese has gone from 26% to 3%. The number who have identified as Taiwanese has gone from something like 15% to 63%. And the number who say Taiwanese Chinese has gone from roughly 45% to 30%. The people of Taiwan see themselves as separate. Now you can say, well, that's not really accurate. They speak Chinese, they're still basically Chinese, it should be part of China. You know, you could say that. You could say that to Americans in 1776 too. You could say, you're basically English, come on, speak the same language. It's not the way it works. So when we come to this question of the one China policy, the words of the Shanghai Communique are pretty clear on that respect. It said, the United States acknowledges, let's just stop right now, doesn't agree. The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on both sides of the strait believe there is only one China and that Taiwan is part of it. We are nearly at the point where there are no Chinese on the island side of the Taiwan Strait, quite apart from everything else that came after the Shanghai Communique. So, coming to the immediate situation of strategic ambiguity, your question is very timely, since yesterday, or Sunday, Europe time, President Biden was asked for the fourth time, if China attacked Taiwan, would the United States come to Taiwan's defense militarily? And he said yes. Now, of course, for the fourth time within a few hours, the White House said that doesn't represent any change in policy. So I think the White House is still endorsing strategic ambiguity because two different parts of it say two different things at any given time. The doctrine of strategic ambiguity was intended at the outset to enhance the credibility of an American deterrent, to leave China guessing what the United States would do. Now, strategic ambiguity is fine when it's managed by Henry Kissinger, but we don't have any Henry Kissingers around today in government to manage it. So to reduce the risk of mistake, I think the time has long since come to abandon the ambiguity and be clear, as President Biden has been, although his administration has not.
But instead of going to war or making a clear commitment to defend Taiwan in case it is invaded, isn't it going to be a smarter strategy to equip Taiwan with the capabilities to sink all those Chinese ships trying to cross the strait, and thus using China's invasion as an opportunity to halt the rise of China, to stop China's aggressive expansionism, and to engineer the irreversible decline of China? Is it going to be less costly and smarter? And if you look at the the war in Ukraine, I think crossing 100 nautical mile Taiwan Strait should be far more difficult than crossing Dnieper River or by Russian, armored vehicles. So depending on how strongly you empower and equip Taiwan with defensive capabilities, isn't this a feasible option?
Well, the assertion of what the United States would do in the event of an attack on Taiwan is obviously not to invite the attack, but to deter the attack, to make it clear to China that the cost it would pay if it did undertake aggression would be far greater than any benefits it could hope to achieve. That's what the language of Article 5 in the NATO treaty is intended to mean when it says an attack on one shall be treated as an attack on all. That should say to the Soviet Union, don't even think about it. And it worked. I think the same approach should be taken not just with respect to Taiwan, but all around the Chinese periphery in the Indo-Pacific. I think America's alliance structure in the region reflects the circumstances that we faced for a long time and that the countries in the region faced. I think it's different now. I think the Chinese threat is existential for the rest of this century. And if we don't have more collective defense, collective security arrangements in place, the Chinese will divide and conquer. I think that is essentially their approach. So they'd like to focus on Taiwan, and they'd like other countries to say, well, two China, one China. If you asked in Japan today, I think a clear majority of people would say an attack on Taiwan is tantamount to an attack on Japan. And the idea that we can act singly and apart faced with the kind of threat that's emerging from China, I think is a mistake. I think if we don't have more deterrence capabilities, we will learn that lesson. And let's be clear, I listened to the conversation of the two prime ministers, president and prime minister, just before, talking about how successful the Western alliance has been in Ukraine. The Western alliance failed in Ukraine, failed on February the 24th, failed before that by not deterring the Russians. We happy to have this war in Ukraine that's grinding the country into the dust, even though the Russians have clearly not achieved all of their objectives? This is failure. The war is failure. NATO did not succeed in deterring the Russians from attacking. Now, there's a lot of history in that, but the fact is that the Russians thought they could get away with it, and they may yet. In East Asia, South Asia, alliance structures are nowhere near as strong and as dense as alliance structures across the North Atlantic. That imperils all of us. And I would just say, having the opportunity to be here in South Korea to give a little free advice to our friends, the Republic of Korea can make an enormous contribution by thinking regionally, by thinking how to extend its enormous capabilities in conjunction with others. I understand, for example, and don't need to repeat the history between Korea and Japan. I understand the strong feelings here. I've heard them repeatedly. I understand the feelings in Japan, but our mutual safety at some point requires getting past the history. It's not going to be easy. I understand that. It's a long conversation. I can only hope to make the point inadequately and briefly here. But for the good of our citizens in Korea, in Japan, in the United States, we have got to find a way to work more cooperatively together on defense issues. The United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor, and we went through a brutal war with Japan, as Korea did. And now Japan is one of our strongest allies. It is possible to overcome the history. And I admit again, I don't want anybody to believe that I think this is easy, but I urge, and I would urge in Japan to think about how to do this. And not just here in Northeast Asia, but around the Chinese periphery. We've seen some amazing steps just in the past few years. The idea of the Quad of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Personally, I don't see any reason why that couldn't become a Quint and have the Republic of Korea in it. You've seen about the plan to get Australia nuclear-powered submarines, the AUKUS partnership with Australia, the UK, and the US. And I'm not necessarily just talking about nuclear-powered submarines. This kind of partnership is possible, and I think entirely appropriate for Korea, Japan, and others to engage in. We've all got to think about the bigger question of the threat of China. Europe and the United States had to face the Soviet threat in the days after World War II, and I think you got to give China credit for long-term strategic thinking, which we're not great at, but we need long-term strategic thinking from our friends and partners here in the region, because we will all be better off if we can accomplish it.
Well, Ambassador Bolton, we are running out of time, but I have two more short questions. I'm thinking of a linkage between Taiwan and North Korea. Do you think it's possible for the U.S. to play Taiwan card to get China to be more serious, more forceful in denuclearizing North Korea? For instance, can the U.S. set a deadline for denuclearization of North Korea and inform China that U.S. will make an official commitment to defend Taiwan if China fails to denuclearize North Korea by that timeline? Is it a feasible idea, or is Taiwan too important to a card to play for denuclearization?
Well, I think we've already played the card. I mean, as I say, I think if you asked in Congress today, should the United States come to Taiwan's defense militarily, the response would be overwhelmingly yes. But I think the point you made at the beginning of the question is important. Korea, China is not a separate issue from Taiwan, China. China has one global strategy, and we are all defensive parts of it. And so it is, if we let China call the shots where it's going to apply pressure and how it hopes to split a potential coming together of other countries in the region, we're ceding the strategic initiative to China, and that's a big mistake.
One last question. If Ukraine succeeds to exhaust Russian energy and its aggressive power in Europe, do you think it will make East Asia more peaceful, because Russia will have less energy left to make trouble in this neighborhood and less power to back up China's aggressive expansionist policies? So it's good news for Korea, for East Asia, when Russia consumes all this energy in Europe?
Well, I think we'll have to see further developments in the war in Ukraine. But I think the recent Ukrainian advances for the first time have put the Putin regime in real domestic difficulty. And, you know, when the time comes when the Russian people actually get to pick their government, then I think we're going to see something potentially very different. But I think the result in the near term of a Russian defeat will be to make it even more a junior partner in the China-led coalition. Something the Russians, I don't think, have seen as a danger to them. But I think that China's aspirations in Asia over the term of this century may include looking northward as well as looking outward from the east and the south.
Well, I think we have no time left to take questions from the floor. So I apologize for that. But I would like to thank Ambassador Bolton for sharing his knowledge, his wisdom with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. John Bolton and Mr. Chun Young-woo. I think it was a privilege to listen in on that conversation. Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we will conclude the official opening ceremony of World Knowledge Forum 2022. For the next 3 days, various discussions will be held under this year's theme, Supercompensation, Restoring Global Prosperity and Freedom. Each session will provide professional knowledge and diverse information, so I do hope that you join us until the end. Meanwhile, the next session, titled Resilience in Our Evolving Business Environment, will begin at approximately 10 minutes later. Please return to this hall by that time. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Chi-Young Lee, for the sessions of the World Knowledge Forum 2022. We'll now begin the session titled Resilience in Our Evolving Business Environment. Mr. Bob Sternfels, Global Managing Partner of McKinsey & Company, prepared this session. He's passionate about innovation, and over the past decade, he has expanded the firm's capabilities in digital advanced analytics, implementation, transformation, and most recently, sustainability. He's a founding member and a chair of the African Leadership Group and member of the Business Roundtable, Asia Business Council, Fortune CEO Initiative, New York Job CEO Council, Tsinghua SEM Advisory Board, Trilateral Commission, and the Board of Focus Capital on the long term. Now let's listen to a lecture, Mr. Bob Sternfels, Global Managing Partner at McKinsey & Company. So please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Greetings, Daewon Jang and honored guests. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the 23rd World Knowledge Forum. I'm excited to speak with this group again. I really enjoyed it last year, and although I cannot join you in person, I'm glad I can join virtually. I want to talk about resilience, and maybe to start, I could define what do we mean by resilience. I'd offer we're living in volatile times with major disruptions, geopolitical tensions, inflation, climate, ongoing impact of the pandemic. And to me, resilience means that organizations must be able to play offense and defense at the same time. Often our focus has been too much on recovery and playing defense. But truly resilient organizations don't just recover and survive, they thrive. This is key to ensuring a sustainable, inclusive future for all. Resilience both enables and depends on meaningful economic growth, emphasizing improved quality of life, equality, and inclusiveness. We need to apply resilience at several levels. For public-private, it's working together through the COVID pandemic. Across value chains, it's minimizing disruptions. For companies, it's ensuring sustainable business growth. And at our individual level, it's leading through disruptive times. Our latest research shows that inaction on resilience can be quite costly. The impact of resilience, or maybe more accurately, the lack of it, on annual GDP growth is between 1% and 5% globally. Shocks disproportionately affect the most vulnerables in society. Around the world, the question on everyone's mind is how can we prepare for the unpredictable? Now, companies who are resilient generate greater shareholder value than less resilient peers across the life cycle of major economic shocks. From 2007 to 2009, resilient companies generated 20% more shareholder returns than non-resilients. If you fast forward to the pandemic, resilience generated 10% more total shareholders returns from Q4 2019 to Q2 2020, and that accelerated to 50% more returns from Q2 2020 to today. I believe the key issue for leadership in these uncertain times is resilience. McKinsey has now partnered with the president of the World Economic Forum to set up a resilience consortium. This brings together both public and private sector, and it aims to develop a common resiliency framework and coordinated resilience agenda to share best practices with both public and private institutions alike. Now, if we turn to Asia, what's the imperative for resilience in Asia? People, organizations, and economic buffers are becoming exhausted from constantly operating in crisis mode. We all know Asia is on track to account for 40% of the world's capital consumption and more than 50% of global GDP by 2040. However, there's major disruptions both today and on the horizon across Asia. Energy, component, and raw material prices are rising at the fastest rate in more than 4 decades. How can organizations respond to inflation and secure access to the physical resources they need? If we look at Korea, for example, Korea leads the world on manufacturing and is blessed with low industrial energy prices. But with a commitment to net zero by 2050, how will Korea be resilient in the face of rising energy costs? On the supply chain side, disruptions cost the average organization almost half of 1 year's profit over the course of a decade. How can companies secure these supply chains to mitigate these costs? For example, Toyota suffered 6 months of reduced production after the 2011 earthquake, and by revamping their production strategy and supply chains, they resumed production 2 weeks after the 2016 earthquake in Japan. If we turn to net zero, meeting the net zero ambition will require an additional $130 trillion worldwide in global expenditure on capital assets by 2030. How can companies turn these net zero transitions into lasting competitive advantage? And think about this as investment versus cost. For example, in Korea, the bold target that Korea has set to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, which includes reduction in coal-fired power plants, which is Korea's #1 energy source. How will we secure the future of those impacted by this energy transition? So how can we be resilient through the face of all this? I'd argue we need to think of resilience as a muscle that we can grow and strengthen across 3 lenses. The first lens is the organizational lens, shifting organization models to be more agile. The second is a value chain lens, across a value chain. How do companies collaborate on things such as integrated supply chains? And the final is at an individual personal resilience level. How do we invest in our most important assets, our people, to build personal resilience? So let's look at each of these. Let's look at embedding organizational resilience first. How do you build organizational resilience? Embedding resilience into major strategic decision processes, creating cross-organizational models, and getting senior leaders focused on resilience in their day-to-day are some of the key elements here. And if you break that down further, I'd argue there's 4 things to think about. The first starts with measurement. We can define resilience in an organizational context and measure it. We've learned through the 2008-09 financial crisis, largely starting in the banking sector, that organizations can measure resilience. We can do this through stress testing, quantification, and running of scenario planning. So measurement as the first indicator. The second is investment in technology. Investment in technology is around new data sources, new analytic methods, etc. And what this allows is new insights and new predictive capabilities. The third is structure. Rethinking organizational structures that have resilience bedded into the roles. Chief resilience officers, for example, should this be part of the structure? And how to think about each core process in an organization that assesses not only optimization, but resilience as part of a core process. And the fourth is then capability building, personal capability building. How much of our training budgets actually go to building resilience as a muscle? If all organizations could adopt these 4 capabilities, I'd argue that they could achieve a resilience premium valued in their stock price. So organizational resilience is one. Let's turn to the second, which is achieving value chain resilience. So resilience across multiple players in a value chain. Value chain resilience will give us the ability to recover much more quickly from shocks and challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need for value chain resilience. The effects of present pandemic-related supply shocks will continue to appear as a result of trade policy changes, workforce scarcity, and inflation. Shocks that affect global production are growing more frequent and severe. Companies can expect to lose 40% of 1 year's EBITDA every decade. So investing to minimize these losses can pay off. How do we shape future value chains to mitigate disruptions and create end-to-end transparency? It starts with bold collaboration between public and private sectors. Public and private sectors are interdependent in periods of disruption. The pandemic showed us this, and we must work better together to build resiliency measures. Tight-knit collaboration will target investments and avoid duplication of effort. It will also speed us up. Investment in technology will allow us to predict value chain stability or instability. We can integrate data from across the value chains to accelerate decision-making. For example, one leading Asian manufacturer used this approach during the pandemic. When volumes fell, the company avoided shortages and margin increased. We can design flexibility and build buffers into value chains by working together. We can invest to create viable alternatives, for example, multiple suppliers across several geographic regions. And we can add redundancy by increasing safety factors in products or maintaining higher stock levels for critical resources. So the second notion, value chains. Let's turn to the final one, which is building our personal resilience muscle. Resiliency is not only organizational and value chain, but also personal in our leaders, employees, quite frankly, all of us. We need to think of resilience as a skill we can teach and learn and refine. We can think about building personal resilience in two ways. Strengthen leaders' resilience to thrive amidst disruption. Enhance senior leaders' resilience capabilities and ways of working by holding leadership summits, investing in training, and learning what more adaptive, resilient leadership means. The second aspect is we can invest more in training all employees to navigate potential future disruptions. This ensures that employees can handle stress, insecurity, and uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed. To close, I'd like to leave you with one parting thought. How resilient is the entity you lead? Are you playing offense and defense at the same time? Are you not just surviving the storm, but instead using the challenges to grow and come out stronger? How much collaboration is needed to reimagine Korea and the broader global community, across units of your own business, across your value chain, and across public-private partnerships? We must work together with others in this room to help Korea and other nations be more resilient. I hope this encourages you to continue the conversation on how resilience can help you extend strategic distance. Thank you.
Thank you again to Mr. Bob Sternfels for the enlightening words. Next, Global Economic Outlook 2023 Risks of Tightening session will begin at 11:10 a.m. So please return to Seoul by 11:05. Thank you. 오찬 참석 대상자분들.
For those who are invited to the luncheon, let me make some housekeeping announcements. There will be the first round and the second round of the luncheon. You can go to Ruby, Topaz, Emerald, and Internal Garden for your lunch. The first round will be from 11:30 till 12:30, and the second round of luncheon will be provided from 12:30 till 1:30 p.m. For those who are applied for the lunch services, please make sure to go and enjoy your lunch at your dedicated time. For those who are not applied for luncheon in advance, you may go to the registration desk on the second floor and proceed with that. And please follow the guidance of the staff members and walk up to the hotel facilities. For those who are not able to walk uphill, please utilize the shuttle services.
Also,
가방을 반드시 가지고 이동해 주시기 바랍니다. 그리고 2층에 자리하신 참석자분들께서는 1층으로 내려오셔서
On the second floor.
We'll now begin the session, Global Economic Outlook 2023, Risks of Tightening. The moderator for this session is Mr. Song Tae-yoon, Professor of Yonsei University. So please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Okay, thanks for inviting me to this honorable session. So I'm the Professor Tae-yoon Song at Yonsei University. I would moderate this wonderful session with worldly renowned, remarkable speakers. As you know, we have here Professor John Chambers, and we also have the Professor Paul Krugman, and we also have the Professor Richard Baldwin, and online we also have the Professor Stephen Roach. You can see the Stephen Roach online. Okay, so today I would like to begin today's session. As you know, today's main session's topic is the global economic outlook for the next year, 2023. Now we are facing a lot of issues in the global economy. So how we can evaluate those issues and how we can prepare for the future. Especially, we are focusing the risk of the tightening in 2022 and also 2023. So let me begin today's session by asking a question to John Chambers. So can you please give what is the risk of contraction or tightening? Can you give that risk, or you can use some examples of the U.S.?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. And I think that probably when the organizers came up with the topic for today's discussion, the risks of tightening, perhaps that risk was more present in their minds then than it would be now, when probably the risks of not tightening are more forefront in our minds. But I think that I can give you a few examples from the past of the risks of tightening that might be useful for us to think about. And the first one I'm going to use comes from Friedman and Schwartz. It's 100 years ago. We're talking about the period during World War I and just thereafter. And because of, and this is of course a US example, because of fiscal dominance during the war and immediately afterwards, the newly established Federal Reserve Bank kept the discount rate quite low, and inflation was increasingly becoming problematic. And once the government, and of course during the World War I, the government was issuing a great deal of bonds to finance the war effort. When the government was able to bring its fiscal position back under control, at that point inflation, we're talking about 1920 or so, was running about 20%. And the leading light of the chairman of the Fed at the time was Benjamin Strong. He was on extended sick leave with tuberculosis. He was the intellectual light of the Fed. And at that point, the Fed pretty much panicked. They rose in like 6-week time the discount rate from 4% to 7% in order to staunch the inflation. And as a result, the wholesale prices in the next year collapsed by 56%, and the economy contracted by 4%, and bank failures increased tenfold to 500. And the Fed then reversed course, and the economy eventually bounced back. But in the meantime, the United States had one of the sharpest contractions ever. Now, that was a long time ago, and we can think of some examples that are more frequent. So we read in Acharya and Rajan and others lately the example of quantitative tightening that caused some disruptions in the repo market in September 2019 and in March of 2020, when in intraday trading, the repo market had rates that are around over in double digits. And there's many causes between that, but probably the proximate cause in 2019 was very high government debt issuance, and in 2020 was, of course, COVID. But there were some fundamental flaws in the financial system itself, and if we look at the commercial banking side, Rajan and Acharya argue that the bank's liability structure had become overly short.
I think it was Mark Twain who said about the Holy Roman Empire that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Inflation Reduction Act is not about inflation or reduction. I guess it is an act. The Inflation Reduction Act is a climate bill with some healthcare subsidies attached to it. And it's a climate bill that tries to deal with it tries to deal with climate issues not in the economics textbook fashion. The economics textbook would say have a carbon tax, but that's been deemed to be politically impossible and also arguably not actually the right way to go economically. Instead, it deals with it by subsidizing clean energy, essentially, which has nothing to do with inflation. I mean, they're called it the Inflation Reduction Act so that one Senator Joe Manchin could say he was fighting inflation. It really is. It has nothing to do with what it's about. And the subsidies are nationalistic. The subsidies for clean energy do require domestic levels of domestic content, so that it is in important ways it is a protectionist bill. You ask why we do that. The answer was the politics of it was extremely difficult. It's a miracle that we actually got a serious climate bill in the United States. You know, remember this was passed with zero margin. It was passed by 50 senators plus the vice president's vote, and the only way to get, and this is to get action on climate, was to be able to sell it as a domestic jobs bill. It required this. Does the bill, in so doing, is it protectionist? Yes, there are protectionist aspects to it. Is it in violation of U.S. trade agreements? Probably, yes. Is that a reason not to do it? No, because the climate is more important than anything else. And if this has always been the case, when we used to have a discussion about carbon border taxes, border adjustments for carbon, the question was, are those border adjustments GATT legal? And the answer was yes, surely they are, but even if the WTO should decide that they aren't GATT legal, the hell with it. The saving the planet is more important than the GATT. And I'm afraid, I hate to say this, but I think that saving the planet is more important than strictly adhering to U.S. trade agreements. We could not have gotten this. This was our last chance to get serious climate legislation before catastrophe, unless possibly it's too late. But and we could not have gotten it without it being American jobs creation. So it's going to be problematic. With some luck, we'll find ways to make it less onerous over time. But do not, whatever you do, don't think that it has anything at all to do with inflation.
Okay, thank you. So Richard, so we just talked about some trade issues. So and then there is some change in trade pattern, I guess, during this pandemic and also in the post-pandemic area. According to my memory, I guess when we had the 2008 global financial crisis, there was a huge drop in trade, and then we believe that can have a negative impact on the global economy. Then how there are some changes from those patterns, or if there are new patterns in this era of tightening age. So can you give that idea?
Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to take a long run at that question, which is really a forward-looking question. And I want to start with a quote following my supervisor, Paul Krugman.
Yeah.
It's my favorite science fiction writer, William Gibbons, said, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed yet." So whenever you're going to talk about the future, even will we have a recession or not, it's very important to see where we are right now. And I think it's a point that hasn't been made, that we got here to this current situation through a concatenation of three unlikely, unconnected events that condition everything that's going to go forward. So let me just go through those quickly. COVID-19. It led to a forced recession, a kind of recession we probably haven't seen ever, certainly not on a global scale. The IMF called it the Great Lockdown. That triggered massive government spending in countries all over the world and a very large debt accumulation in a very low interest rate environment. Corporations also piled up on debt, partly because of that. And that debt pile, that debt bomb, is going to matter going forward. And lastly, it led to a kind of strange twist that I don't think we'd ever seen before between services and goods. People stopped consuming services, started spending it on goods. Moreover, they shifted from buying in person to buying online. And that twist led to big snarls in the global supply chains, which led to some price rises, in particular in a few items, quite sharp price rises. And then the geostrategic tensions, especially between the US and China, started heating up, and the restrictions from those led to further price increases, especially for semiconductors and anything that had semiconductors in it. So we have these kind of bubbling, idiosyncratic price rises, and then Russia invades Ukraine, triggering massive, unexpectedly large sanctions against Russia, and Russia counter-sanctions against Europe, most recently shutting off the gas, which led to an absolute explosion in commodity prices in energy and food. Now, countries who import a lot of energy, especially those who price on the margin, like England, saw fantastic rises in their inflation in a very short period of time. Now, these sort of three trends were viewed as transitory at the time, and also the type of shocks that monetary policy shouldn't try to address. As they say, raising the interest rate won't fix the global supply chain. But now, with all three of these things going and inflation threatening to really take off and stay off, central banks have reacted very rapidly, and that's been discussed a couple times. So going forward, there's really three things that I think are potentially unexpected or potentially problematic. First is the US, EU, and potentially China are tightening. Certainly on the monetary side, to a certain extent on the fiscal side, or may soon, but they're not coordinating. And it is possible that each of them, acting in an individually rational way, end up pushing the economy into a recession because they're not coordinating. Of course they talk, but Europe has enormous pressure from Germans, for example, to show that they're fighting inflation. Same thing's going on in the United States. And they're not going to say, well, we don't raise because they did. The second, emerging markets, at least some of them, have a debt problem. And that debt problem was acquired in a low interest rate environment. And we've seen this before in the 80s, where rising interest rates meant your debt cost increased many times, and a recessionary environment, which reduces their ability to earn dollars to pay off that debt, and you could get a debt crisis, an emerging market crisis. Of course, these aren't original thoughts when people talk about the fragile 5 or 4 or whatever. And lastly, especially in this part of the world, geostrategic dangers are a real issue. Right now, this part of the world has dodged the worst aspects of the geostrategic tension that I think many people fear. Europe has not. Europe has a hot war on land going and leading to war-like problems in Europe. For instance, people buying iodine pills, people storing water at home, things like that. Hasn't happened here, but it could. So these 3 unanticipated things could come together to cause a recession. Now, I don't know whether that will happen or not, and I'll end with this saying, those who live by the crystal ball soon learn to eat broken glass. So I won't predict that there'll be a recession or not, but I would just point out that there's some unexpected dangers out there that may combine together in ways that we can't anticipate. So maybe in the discussion I'll talk about the future of trade and things like that. I think that's a hopeful thing going forward, but I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. So, then, Stephen, so as you were mentioning about some recessions, but whenever we have the global recession, China works as a cushion for some managing the global damage. But now we are in a different situation. Can you evaluate the China's current role and what's going to happen in the future?
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to address you by video. I wish I could be sitting on that stage with the rest of you. The question you raise about China is very important because up until now, China has been a critical buffer for the world when it has gone into recession in the past. That was certainly the case during the global financial crisis and its immediate aftermath. And that is unlikely to be the case this time. The China cushion that we have counted on for so long is basically vanished into thin air. And I just want to underscore a couple of numbers. In the 2012 to 2016 period, just a few years after the global financial crisis, the world economy grew on average 3.4% during that 6-year period. China grew about 7.5%. It accounted for 34% of all of global GDP during those 6 years. Do a little bit of global growth accounting, and you will find that absent China during those 6 years, world economic growth did not come close to 3.4%, but in fact averaged 2.3%. And typically we think of the global recession threshold at around 2.5%. So the China cushion is really what kept the world from lapsing back into renewed recession in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. You think China's going to average 7.5% over the next few years and do the same thing this time? If you do, I've got a box of cheap jewelry, and I'd like a little bit of your time after this session to sell it to you. China's growth cushion is under serious pressure, and this comes from somebody who has been, for most of my career, an unabashed optimist on China. But I am no longer in that camp. Several
part of this whole thing. I mean, if I can say, just the and I'll be talking about this more this afternoon, but we're in a world where I think everyone is now aware of the fragility of global supply chains. Everyone is aware of the political risks involved in international trade. The national security clause of the GATT, which we all kind of treated as an irrelevant thing, suddenly looms like a very large thing. And so there's, you cannot expect, this is not the world of the previous generation where you could where you could abstract both from domestic political and national security concerns. So I don't think the Biden administration is actively seeking to have a trade conflict with China, but I don't think it's prepared to sacrifice any domestic political capital to ease relations either.
Okay, so I guess Richard might have something to add, I guess.
Sure, let me just add a couple refinements of the basic analyses that I totally agree with Stephen and Paul. So, I mean, it's worthwhile saying that Trump didn't just not like trade with China. Trump didn't like trade. He put on tariffs against Canada, against the European Union.
National security tariffs against
Canada. So I remember the year that Trump went to Davos when I was there, and I had two of his senior officials, Milton Wilbur and what was his USTR, explained to me, you know, the Trump administration is for free trade, but we're being cheated, and you can tell it because we have a big deficit, and we're going to do something about it. So completely nonsensical. But if you believe that the deficit is a sign of being unfair, then it's not just China, it's everybody, and that's what they acted. Now, what Biden's doing is being more targeted. So Biden has negotiated removal of some of the trade tariffs in exchange for quotas. So he's becoming less blunt about being anti-trade and more focusing on anti-China. So the other thing I'd like to point out is that Biden is a Democrat, and the Democrats have always had a problem with trade. And it's especially so now that some of the swing states, really it's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, those are some states that really care about trade, that are heavily Democratic. So Biden has an internal Democratic problem with looking like trade liberalization. But he's trying to do everything he can apart from that by signing trade agreements that don't have trade in them, or in particular removing tariffs. So he's trying to do deals where there's things on privacy and electronic signatures and things like that. So he is more open than Trump was, but he is limited by that. And then just to end, their trade is back to where it was pre-COVID. So even with all these terrible things going on, the world of trade system is working relatively well.
Okay. So John has worked in S&P for a long time, especially in the area of sovereign credit rating. So I guess the current situation to dampen the inflation in the U.S., we know that that monetary policy might have a big impact on other countries' sovereign risk. So can you evaluate the current situation and the future prospects on the impact of U.S. monetary policy
on the U.S.? Well, you know, the U.S. issues the key reserve currency. The credibility of the Fed is quite high. As Professor Krugman says, inflation expectations are still anchored. I'm not sure they're well anchored, but they're anchored. The depth and sophistication of the banking and capital markets is without peer. So that's not really the problem with the United States. I think the problem, getting back to the politics, is the fractious nature of the political environment. Professor Krugman says we had a failed coup d'etat on the 6th of January in 2021, and the fact that it was naive and amateurish doesn't make it any less seditious. And you know, this augurs quite poorly for the United States, and we've seen, you know, institutions matter, and elected officials put in place people into positions in the administration that where they can do real damage. We've seen that in Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk, and we've got, you know, more guns than people in this. In the United States, and under certain conditions they can be mobilized. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to have a civil war in the United States, but I think what you're going to have is from one administration to another, they're going to not be able to legislate. They'll try to implement their agenda through administrative measures, which you could call decrees, and that is going to make policy making very unpredictable one administration to the next. And that's going to put you on a lower growth path than you would have been otherwise.
Okay. So then the currently we have talked about the financial issues in emerging markets, so based on the impact of the U.S. But Steve, so far we had some concerns on the financial situation in China. And then if there are conflicts or the trade issues between U.S. and China, I mean, as far as China is owning U.S. dollars or something like that, that impact or the problem might not appear. But currently, we are concerned about some financial structural issues, because if the trade conflict have some impact on the Chinese economy and the growth, then what is your opinion or the prospect for the financial structure or the financial situation in China? Because in Korea, we might have some impact, so we are pretty much concerned about that issue.
Well, you have good right to be concerned. In May of 2016, there was an interview on the front page of China's state newspaper, People's Daily, that contained a stark warning issued by an individual who preferred to be called, as is only the case in China, an authoritative person. Wouldn't really tell you who his name is. But he had studied very carefully the case of Japan. He may have even read Paul Krugman's article in, I want to say, what was it, 1998 in the Brookings Papers about the liquidity trap. He warned that if China stayed the course of debt-intensive growth that it was on, that it was running the risk of asset bubbles, economic crises. He even used the word widespread incidents of corporate and state-owned enterprise zombies that would impair the Chinese economy for many, many years to come, and enter into an L-shaped period of stagnant growth, very reminiscent of Japan. And shortly thereafter, the government under Xi Jinping embraced this deleveraging campaign to transition away from debt-intensive growth. And every time they tried to do it, some risks to economic growth would emerge and they would back down. And now they're sort of not backing down, at least on the property sector. And they've had, some clear and significant failures, especially in the Evergrande area. But they have not really tackled the debt problems in state-owned enterprises, because to do that, they'd be attacking themselves, because the state doesn't want to go after
the state. But, you know, the financial system in China is, in many respects, it's got an ample a cushion of liquidity, but it's state-directed, it's not market-based. The allocation of capital is, in its best of days, imperfect. You know, the risk of further accidents certainly cannot be ruled out, and that would, of course, inflict some collateral damage, especially on many East Asian economies, including, I might say, South Korea, which is so heavily dependent on China as its major trading partner. So I think, you know, the government is committed in theory to deleveraging, but you know, they've only executed part of that theory, and they're really reluctant to go after the largest source of debt-intensive growth, which are the state-owned enterprises.
Okay, so Paul, so let me give one quick question. Did you anticipate, or did you expect, or forecast the war between Russia and Ukraine?
Oh gosh, no. I mean, I was paying no attention whatsoever to this, and part of the issue was that it was clearly we're kind of, it's very much like the, you know, just before the First World War, there were people pointing out entirely correctly that war was a really stupid thing in the modern world, that war was going to be economically destructive, that you could only make yourself worse off by launching wars of aggression. And many people assumed that that would mean that they wouldn't happen. And then we got the First World War, and here we have something which it was clear by any rational calculation it made no sense for Russia to invade Ukraine, but we're not dealing with the realm of rational calculation. So I didn't see this coming, and I've never, you know, it's been an extraordinary thing. I mean, it's the global implications have been huge, although I have to say, in some ways, by proving the point that aggressive wars are a really bad idea, in some ways Putin may have actually helped the world, and you know, we're not, that's a really weird thing to say right now, because there's people, thousands of people are dying as we speak, but it's, you know, anyway, no, I didn't see this coming.
But if I rephrase my question in the sense that even though you did not expect the Russia-Ukraine war itself, do you thought that there was a global economic environment that we might have more conflicts that might develop into war?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone, I don't think I was alone in thinking this, that the sort of, you know, the United States is a gradually declining power in relative terms, despite the dominance of the dollar and everything else. And the Pax Americana, the world in which this kind of thing really couldn't happen because the big guy on the block would not allow it to happen, has clearly been eroding for a long time. So if it hadn't been there, it might have been somewhere else. And I think you should actually be thankful that it didn't, you know, the most obvious other place where something like this might happen is a lot closer to you than Ukraine. So, no, I mean, the thought that something bad could happen, it clearly occurred to a lot of us. The decline, I mean, I'm not an international relations specialist, but I do talk to international relations specialists, and they talk about hegemonic stability. And when you have a declining hegemon, then we have a problem.
Okay. So do you have anything to add, Richard? No. Okay. So we are almost there. So let us have the final one round of the all participants. So if you have anything that you want to add for your final remark, I would like to give the 2 minutes for each participants. What about let me begin the final round from John.
Well, I would just say that I agree that the world economy is resilient, that these risks can be contained, that recession is imminent in Europe and in the United States, and the conditions in China, as Professor Roach has emphasized, are actually quite dire in the property market. You know, I think we've gotten through worse, and we'll get through this.
Okay, thank you. What about Paul?
Okay, I actually think the most important contributor to our discussion is Stephen Roach, because if I think about where the world is right now, there are three great economic superpowers in the world. They're actually all more or less equal sized at this point. There's the United States, there's the European Union, and there's China. I think that the United States and Europe are both actually pretty resilient and are going to get through this. China is the one that has me deeply worried. China appears to be structurally in a very bad place. China needs a drastic reform of its whole model. And so we're mostly focused, most of us, not Stephen, but most of us are focused on the North Atlantic issues. But China is actually where the most intractable problems are now, and where in economic terms we should be most frightened.
Okay, thank you. Richard?
Well, I think I'd echo John. The third and fourth quarters of this year and next year could be very tough, especially in Europe. It'll more like rationing of energy, cold buildings, that could be tough. But I believe that inflation will be put back into a box. There may be a recession, but it won't be a terrible recession because there's a lot of resilient forces coming up. And I think the economy will return to normal, hopefully maybe with some super compensation with stronger companies. But I think it's mostly a transitory thing that we have to get through. So I'm somewhat optimistic, although I very much agree with Paul that if China falls down, that could be a really big thing. But we've been saying China might fall down for a pretty long time.
Okay, what about Steve?
Yeah, the one thing in listening to this discussion, which has been fascinating, that sort of gets me a little nervous, is this idea of developments that can be temporary, so we just have to wait them out. And, you know, I truly remember doing this in my first job when I worked for, I was going to say a famous, but now probably an infamous Federal Reserve chairman by the name of Arthur Burns, where everything was transitory. You know, he made the Federal Reserve staff, which I was a part of at the time, create versions of the CPI that took out transitory things. And that became known as the core CPI. And, you know, we did this dutifully for Arthur Burns, you know, year in and year out, transitory shock after transitory shock, until the mid-70s, when, you know, we stripped out maybe, you know, 50% of the CPI. And Burns figured out that the core CPI, which then excluded food and energy and home ownership and children's toys and women's jewelry and mobile homes and you name it, was then going up at a double-digit rate. And he said, I think we have an inflation problem. And we wanted to save, but we wanted to hold on to our jobs. What do you mean? We have a problem. You have a problem. So, you know, I take the point on transitory, but I think we have to be careful in just assuming that these things will fade on their own without consequences to the rest of the economy and the rest of the world. So I'm a little bit more nervous that things will just revert back to a more comfortable mean than you have heard from others on this panel today.
Okay, thank you. So we had the pretty great session, I guess, the fascinating session with wonderful scholars. So please give a big round of the applause to all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you once again to the moderator and speakers. Next, toward Rebuilding Ukraine session will begin at 12:25 p.m., so please return to the Seoul by 12:20. Thank you. We'll now begin the session toward Rebuilding Ukraine. The moderator for this session is Ms. Na Kyung-won, former member of National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. So please welcome her with a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, everybody. Did you enjoy your lunch? I just take a cup of milk. President Zelensky's Telegram post on the 11th has once again touched the heart of everyone around the globe. His post addressed to Russia starts with the question of, do you still think that we are one nation? And declares that Ukraine will rather live without Russia than without water. He ends his post by saying history will put everything in its place, and that Ukraine will be with gas, light, water, and food, but without Russia. I pay my deepest respect for the Ukrainian resistance forces, and I'm confident in their victory. No, they must be victorious, because that is the only path of protecting core human values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. Currently, liberal democracies around the world, including America and members of the European Union, are sending military or financial aid. India's Prime Minister Modi told Putin that now is not an era of war. And even President Xi has expressed concerns about the war. Ukraine recently recaptured Kharkiv, possibly implying that the tides of war have turned. But the world was shocked once again when mass graves were discovered, indicating civilian massacre. What should we do for Ukraine? I met Deputy Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko at Davos Forum last May as the special envoy of the Korean president. This was the first time a Korean politician met a high Ukrainian officials since the start of war. Before the meeting, I was thinking about how to express my condolence of sorrow of war, how to appropriately express the Korean government's opinion on military aid. But frankly speaking, I have never chanced to express my condolence. Why? I was surprised by three things after meeting the Deputy Prime Minister. The first was that she was a young woman in her 30s. Since I have a strong sense of solidarity with female leaders around the world, I was very happy to see her and connect with her. Secondly, I was surprised by her confident level-headedness. It was a luxury for her to dwell on sadness. She had the crucial task of restoring and reconstructing Ukraine. I could trust her from the confidence and level-headedness she showed when she requested aid. Third, her insight into the future. When she was requesting Korean companies' involvement with the reconstruction of Ukraine and describing the vision of Ukraine, she was not talking about Ukraine before the war, but a transformed, futuristic country. She, of course, requested support for electric vehicles and not fossil fuel-based vehicles. Ladies and gentlemen, do you remember a little girl who sang a song, Let It Go? Yeah. Ukraine has strong-willed citizens of all ages determined to win the war. It also has great leaders like President Zelensky and insightful officials like Deputy Prime Minister Sviridenko. And that is why Ukraine is continuing to fight back Russia and unite the rest of the world in their struggle. They are restructuring the new world order. Now, let's support Ukraine, big or small, government or civilian. Ukraine will be victorious if we support them with all our hearts and hands. They will be victorious in the war, and they will also be victorious in the reconstruction of the nation from the horrors of war. This victory will not just be a victory of the Ukrainian people. This will be a victory of liberal democracy and human rights, a victory for the union of countries centered around these values. Let's go together in these steps to write the correct history and achieve super compensation. Thank you. Let's watch the video.
Your Excellency, Mr. Han Duck-Soo, Your Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Korean friends. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to this great event and also to apologize for not being able to present in person in Seoul. I'm appreciative for this opportunity to address you today on behalf of the Ukrainian government, on behalf of the entire Ukrainian people, who will always remember your willingness and support in the most difficult time for our country. We are grateful for Korea for the real help that we received, including financial and humanitarian assistance. Since the beginning of the full-scale armed aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, the Ministry of National Defense of the Republic of Korea has already provided us for batches of material and technical assistance. During this time, we have received field rations, helmets, body armor, gas masks, medicine, and medical equipment. All this saves our soldiers at the front. We greatly appreciate this support. Today, the invincible Ukrainian people are fighting against the aggression for freedom and independence. But we should already think about what our future will be like. Regardless of anything, in order for Ukraine to have a successful future, we all continue to work together for this. We see the main goal of rebuilding Ukraine as a strong, wealthy, and technological country. After the victory of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield, support of our foreign partners will be crucial for rebuilding Ukraine's economy, as well as for the strengthening the country's stability in the long term. I believe that in the foreseeable future, not only the army, but also the economy of Ukraine will surprise the world with its stability and strength. We must do everything to make Ukraine transition from a transit economy to a developing economy within just 1 decade. We have identified the sectoral direction capable to ensure the achievements of the set goal, in particular the defense industry sector, steel industry, the agro-industrial complex sector. These industries will lead to the development of many other sectors in Ukraine. Ukraine already has what to offer to Korean investors and companies with vision and courage to join us. Today, 614 projects in various areas in the amount of about $425 billion are ready for implementation. A determined business that sees the potential in our country will be able to help realize the economic potential of Ukraine and at the same time turn unused opportunities into advantages. We invite your society, your companies, your state to join the project of quick and demonstrative restoration of Ukraine right now. I wish you further interesting discussion. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you for your words. This concludes this session. Next conversation with Min Jin Lee session will begin at 1 p.m. Thank you.